January 17, 1944. Schweinfurt, Germany, 11:47 a.m. The air raid siren begins as a low moan, then climbs into a wail that tears through the cold winter sky. In the narrow cobblestone streets below the ball-bearing factories, Margarete Hoffmann clutches her daughter's hand and runs toward the public shelter. Her breath comes in white clouds. The child's shoes slap against wet stone. Above them the drone grows louder, a sound like distant thunder that never stops, that only builds, deeper and deeper, until it becomes a physical thing pressing against the chest. Margarete does not look up. No one looks up anymore. They have learned that seeing the formations makes it worse, makes the waiting unbearable. The American bombers are coming again. But today, something will be different. Today, Margarete and her neighbors will discover something that contradicts everything Dr. Goebbels has told them about the enemy across the Atlantic. To understand what happened in the skies over Germany in 1944, one must first understand what had come before. The bombing war had begun years earlier, in 1940, when the Luftwaffe had unleashed its fury on British cities during the Blitz. London, Coventry, Birmingham, these places had burned under German incendiaries. The attacks were not precision strikes against military installations. They were intended to break civilian morale, to terrorize a population into surrender. Hermann Göring himself had promised that German bombers would erase British cities from the map. The raids killed over 40,000 British civilians. Children died in their beds. Families were buried alive in collapsed shelters. The Luftwaffe did not discriminate between factory worker and infant, between soldier and grandmother. When Britain retaliated with its own bomber offensive, the pattern continued. RAF Bomber Command, under Air Marshal Arthur Harris, adopted a policy of area bombing, striking entire urban districts, not just industrial targets. The firestorms of Hamburg in 1943 killed 42,000 people in a single week. Dresden would follow in 1945, with deaths numbering in the tens of thousands. The British justified these raids as necessary to destroy German industrial capacity and worker morale simultaneously. If the workers died along with their factories, so much the better. This was total war, a concept that erased the lines between battlefield and home front, between combatant and civilian. The German people fed a steady diet of propaganda by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, expected the Americans to follow the same pattern. When the United States Army Air Forces began daylight bombing raids over the Reich in 1942, German radio announcers described the incoming bombers as terror flyers who deliberately murdered women and children. Goebbels' newspapers printed photographs of destroyed homes beside dead infants, always with captions blaming American barbarism. The propaganda was not entirely fabricated. Bombs did sometimes miss their targets, and civilians did die in American raids. But what Goebbels never mentioned, what he could never afford to mention, was that these civilian deaths were not the objective. The Americans had adopted a fundamentally different strategy, one based on a doctrine called precision daylight bombing. This doctrine had its roots in American military theory, developed at Maxwell Field's Air Corps Tactical School during the 1930s. Officers like Kenneth Walker and Haywood Hansel believed that modern bombers equipped with advanced bomb sights and flying in daylight could strike specific industrial targets with unprecedented accuracy. The theory held that by destroying key nodes in the enemy's war economy, ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, aircraft plants, strategic bombers could cripple a nation's ability to make war without resorting to the mass slaughter of civilians. It was a vision of warfare that attempted, however imperfectly, to preserve some distinction between soldiers and innocents, between military necessity and mere terror. When American bomber crews climbed into their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators for missions over Germany, they carried explicit orders that reflected this doctrine. Target folders specified exact aim points: the factory floor, the machine shop, the refinery tower. Bombardiers peered through their Norden bomb sights, adjusting for wind and altitude, waiting for the precise moment when the crosshairs aligned with the target. In briefing rooms across England, intelligence officers reminded crews that their mission was to destroy German industrial capacity, not to kill German civilians. Stray bombs that hit residential areas were considered failures of execution, not successes. This was not mercy born of sentiment. American airmen had no love for the Nazi regime, but rather a strategic calculation based on the belief that precision bombing would prove more effective than terror bombing. The reality, of course, was far messier than the doctrine. Bombing from 25,000 feet through clouds and flak and fighter attacks made precision difficult, sometimes impossible. The Norden bomb sight, though technologically advanced, was not a miracle device. Bombs did fall on neighborhoods. They did kill bakers and teachers and children, but the intent mattered and the pattern mattered. When American formations approached a German city, they approached with specific factories marked on their maps, not city blocks selected at random for destruction. Margarete Hoffman knew nothing of American bombing doctrine as she huddled in the shelter beneath Schweinfurt that January morning. What she knew was fear. What she knew was that the radio had told her the Americans were coming to murder her family, that the enemy bombers did not care who lived or died below them. She wrapped her arms around her daughter and waited for the world to end. The formation appeared through broken clouds at 11:52, dozens of silver shapes, moving in tight combat boxes, their contrails writing white lines across the grey sky. The lead bombardier, a 23-year-old lieutenant from Nebraska named James Morgan, studied his target through the bombsight glass. Below him, through patches of cloud, he could see the massive factory complex that produced more than half of Germany's ball bearings, the small but essential components that allowed tanks and aircraft and submarines to function. The target folders had been explicit: destroy the factory buildings, particularly the grinding and assembly halls, avoid the residential districts to the north and west. Morgan's hands moved across the bombsight controls, making minute adjustments. The aircraft shuddered as flak burst around them, black puffs of smoke that filled the air with jagged steel fragments. He blocked it out. His entire world narrowed to the crosshairs, and the factory buildings sliding into view below. The moment arrived, he pressed the release, and 12 500-pound bombs tumbled from the bay. In the shelter, Margarete heard the whistle first, that distinctive falling scream that every civilian in Germany had learned to dread. The impact came as a series of thunderous crashes that shook dirt from the ceiling and made the concrete walls tremble. Once, twice, a dozen times. Children screamed. Someone prayed aloud. The electric lights flickered and died. Then, after what felt like hours but was perhaps only minutes, silence returned, broken only by the fading drone of aircraft engines and the sound of the all-clear siren. When Margarete emerged into daylight, she prepared herself for devastation. She expected to find her apartment block destroyed, her neighbors' homes reduced to rubble, bodies in the streets. This was what happened in bombing raids. This was what had happened in Hamburg, what had happened in Berlin. This was total war. But her street stood intact. The 3-story apartment building where she lived showed no damage. The bakery on the corner had not been touched. The small church with its wooden steeple remained exactly as it had been that morning. Confused, still trembling, Margarete walked toward the sound of sirens and shouting that came from the east, from the direction of the factories. What she found there shocked her into stillness. The Kugelfischer ball-bearing plant, the massive complex where her husband had worked before being conscripted into the Wehrmacht, had been transformed into a landscape of twisted steel and shattered brick. The grinding halls had collapsed. The assembly buildings were burning. Cranes lay toppled like broken toys. Rail cars had been tossed from their tracks. But 50 meters beyond the factory fence, the workers' housing stood undamaged. The administrative offices across the street showed broken windows from blast pressure but remained structurally sound. The destruction had been surgically precise, as if a giant hand had reached down and crushed only the factory itself while leaving everything else intact. Margarete stood at the factory fence and stared. Other civilians gathered around her, equally stunned. An elderly man named Klaus, who had worked at the plant for 30 years, spoke what many were thinking. They hit only the factory, they could see what they were bombing. They chose. This realization, repeated across Germany as American bombing raids continued throughout 1944 and 1945, created a cognitive dissonance that propaganda could not resolve. Goebbels' radio broadcasts insisted that American pilots were barbarians who delighted in massacring German women and children. But German women and children, standing in their undamaged homes and looking at the destroyed factories nearby, could see with their own eyes that something did not match the official narrative. The Americans could have killed them easily. The bombers had flown directly overhead, had dropped dozens of tons of high explosives mere hundreds of meters away. Yet they lived. Their homes stood intact. Only the factories, the refineries, the rail yards had been hit. The German expectation of American bombing had been shaped by their own actions and by British retaliation. Luftwaffe bomber crews, having participated in the terror bombing of Warsaw, Rotterdam and London, assumed that all strategic bombing followed the same pattern. When they spoke among themselves in POW camps after being shot down, many expressed genuine surprise at American target selection. A captured Luftwaffe pilot named Hans Becker, interrogated by American intelligence officers in 1944, stated, "We were told you simply dropped bombs on cities to kill workers and destroy morale. But when I was shot down over Regensburg and saw the damage pattern from the ground, I realized you were actually trying to hit specific buildings. Our own bombers never did this. We simply dropped on the city center and hoped for the best." This admission reveals much. The Germans had expected American bombing to mirror their own methods because they could not imagine a different approach. The concept that an enemy might deliberately attempt to minimize civilian casualties while still prosecuting total war seemed almost naive, a kind of sentimental weakness that professional warriors would exploit. Yet the Americans persisted in this approach, not from weakness but from a calculated strategic philosophy. The precision bombing doctrine faced enormous challenges and skeptics within the Allied command structure. British Air Marshal Arthur Harris openly mocked American daylight precision bombing as an ineffective waste of resources. He argued that only the massive firestorms created by area bombing at night could truly break German industrial capacity. The casualty rates among American bomber crews seemed to validate his criticism. During the first year of the daylight bombing campaign, losses exceeded 25% on some missions. Entire squadrons were wiped out. Flying a complete tour of 25 missions became a statistical improbability. Yet the Americans continued, refining their tactics, improving their fighter escorts, maintaining their focus on specific industrial targets. The Norden bomb sight, though celebrated in American propaganda as a technological marvel that could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, was in practice far less precise. Weather conditions, equipment malfunctions, combat stress, and German defenses all degraded accuracy. Studies conducted after the war revealed that only about 20% of bombs dropped fell within 1,000 feet of their aim points. This meant that 80% missed by more than 1,000 feet, a failure rate that would seem to vindicate area bombing advocates. Yet even with this limited accuracy, the pattern of American bombing remained distinct from British area attacks. When formations struck Schweinfurt, they aimed at the ball-bearing plants. When they hit Plasti, they targeted the oil refineries. When they bombed Regensburg, they focused on the Messerschmitt aircraft factories. Bombs that fell outside the target area were errors, not objectives. The cumulative effect of dozens of raids, each focused on specific industrial complexes rather than city centers, created a visible pattern that German civilians could not ignore. Maria Schneider, a housewife from Augsburg, kept a diary throughout the war years that was later preserved in the Bavarian State Archives. Her entry from March 1944 captures the bewilderment many Germans felt. "Today the Americans bombed the MAN factory where diesel engines are made. The explosions shook our house, but our street was not touched." Henrik says the Amis use some kind of special sight that lets them aim at specific buildings. The radio says this is impossible, that they simply drop bombs everywhere like the British do at night. But I have eyes. I can see that our neighborhood stands while the factory burns. Why would Goebbels lie about something we can see for ourselves? This last question, why would the propaganda ministry lie about something visible to millions, became increasingly difficult for German civilians to answer as the war continued. The cognitive dissonance created by the gap between official narrative and lived experience began to erode trust in Nazi information sources. When Goebbels claimed that American bombers deliberately targeted hospitals and schools, that German civilians who lived near actual hospitals and schools saw those structures survive raids that destroyed nearby factories, the propaganda lost its power. When radio broadcasts described American pilots as bloodthirsty murderers who machine-gunned civilians for sport, but civilians who had experienced American raids recognized that the bombing patterns showed deliberate target selection, the official story became less credible than the evidence of their own eyes. The psychological impact of this realization extended beyond simple propaganda failure. For many Germans, the precision of American bombing forced a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about their own government and military. If the Americans were attempting to minimize civilian casualties, even while prosecuting total war against Germany, what did that say about the Luftwaffe's earlier terror bombing of British cities? What did it say about German military doctrine? Some Germans began to privately acknowledge that perhaps their own leadership had initiated the pattern of civilian targeting, and that the British retaliation, however horrific, had been provoked by German actions. This was a dangerous realization in a police state where expressing doubt about official narratives could result in arrest, torture, and execution. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Wehrmacht soldiers returning from leave in bombed cities, Luftwaffe pilots shot down over Germany and later exchanged in prisoner swaps, workers who commuted to damaged factories, all carried stories that contradicted Goebbels' version of events. Whispered conversations in bread queues and bomb shelters spread the truth. The Americans were bombing factories, not homes. They could see what they hit. They were choosing their targets. The contrast between American precision bombing and British area bombing became stark during raids that occurred on consecutive nights. In November 1944, the city of Freiburg experienced both types of attack within 72 hours. RAF bombers struck first, dropping incendiaries and high explosives across the old town center in a night raid designed to create a firestorm. The medieval city burned for 14 hours. Over 2,000 civilians died. The historic university district, residential areas, churches, and cultural sites were destroyed or heavily damaged. 3 days later, American B-17s had attacked in daylight, targeting the rail yards and marshalling stations on the city's outskirts. The rail facilities were heavily damaged. A nearby warehouse district burned. But the already devastated city center received no additional hits. Residents who had survived the British raid and then witnessed the American attack could directly compare the two approaches. Their conclusion was almost unanimous: the British had tried to kill them, while the Americans had tried to destroy the rail lines. Such comparisons made some Germans question the moral equivalence that propaganda had constructed. If all Allied bombing was equally terroristic, why did British and American raids produce such different patterns of destruction? Why did RAF night raids consistently devastate residential areas while American daylight raids consistently focused on industrial and transportation targets? The strategic rationale behind American precision bombing extended beyond humanitarian considerations. American air doctrine theorists believed that modern industrial economies contained critical nodes, specific factories, refineries, transportation hubs, whose destruction would create cascading failures throughout the entire economic system. This theory, often called industrial web theory, held that by identifying and destroying key components like ball bearings, synthetic fuel plants, and aircraft assembly facilities, strategic bombers could paralyze enemy war production more effectively than by simply killing workers and destroying homes. The Schweinfurt raids exemplified this approach. Schweinfurt produced an estimated 52% of Germany's ball bearings in 1943. Ball bearings, though small and unglamorous, were essential for virtually all military equipment. Tanks, aircraft, submarines, trucks, artillery, all required precisely manufactured bearings to function. American planners believed that destroying Schweinfurt's factories would cripple German weapons production across the board. 2 major raids in 1943 devastated the plants, though at enormous cost to American bomber crews. 60 aircraft were lost in a single mission, earning the October 14, 1943, raid the grim designation, Black Thursday. The raids succeeded in destroying much of Schweinfurt's production capacity. German war planners scrambled to disperse ball-bearing production to smaller facilities scattered across the country, but the expected collapse of German weapons output never materialized. The Germans proved remarkably resilient, drawing on stockpiles, increasing imports from Switzerland and Sweden, and improvising with lower-quality bearings. This resilience led some historians to argue that precision bombing of specific industries failed strategically, that Harris had been right to focus on area bombing instead. Yet this analysis misses a crucial point. The American precision bombing campaign forced Germany to divert enormous resources to defense and dispersal. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns that could have been used on the Eastern Front remained in Germany to defend factories. Hundreds of thousands of workers who could have assembled tanks instead built shelters, dispersed machinery, and repaired damaged facilities. Fighter aircraft that could have supported Wehrmacht ground operations stayed home to intercept bomber formations. The economic disruption caused by constantly repairing targeted facilities, relocating production, training replacement workers, and defending industrial sites created a massive hidden cost that never appeared in German production statistics. Moreover, the precision approach meant that when German factories were eventually overrun by advancing Allied ground forces in 1945, the surrounding cities often remained largely intact. This preservation of civilian infrastructure proved crucial for post-war recovery. Cities like Stuttgart, Mannheim, and Munich, though their factories had been heavily bombed, retained enough housing and civic infrastructure to support returning populations. The Marshall Plan's success in rebuilding West Germany was made possible, in part, because American bombing had destroyed industrial capacity while leaving much residential infrastructure repairable. German civilians, of course, understood none of these strategic calculations as they huddled in shelters during raids. What they understood was immediate and visceral. Bombs were falling, buildings were exploding, people were dying. Yet even in their terror, many maintained the cognitive clarity to distinguish between different types of raids. Diaries, letters, and post-war testimonies consistently show that German civilians could differentiate between American daylight raids that hit specific targets and British night raids that incinerated entire districts. Ursula Gebhardt, a schoolteacher from Mannheim, wrote to her sister in May 1944, "Last night the British came again. They dropped those terrible incendiary bombs that start fires everywhere. Our street was hit. The Müller family's house burned completely. Little Anna died in the cellar. This morning we were still putting out fires when the air raid sirens went off again. We thought we would surely die this time, that the Americans would finish what the British started, but they flew over the city and bombed the chemical plant across the river. We watched from the shelter entrance. We could see the bombs hitting the factory. Not one fell in our direction. Anna is still dead, and I still hate this war, but I cannot hate the Americans the way I hate the British. The Americans killed a factory. The British killed Anna." This distinction, that American bombs killed factories while British bombs killed people, oversimplifies the reality but captures an emotional truth that many Germans experienced. The British had concluded that German civilians were legitimate targets because they supported the Nazi war effort through their labor and their acquiescence to Hitler's regime. The Americans, while sharing this strategic bombing alliance with Britain, maintained a doctrinal commitment to industrial rather than civilian targets. The practical effect of this philosophical difference was visible in the rubble patterns of German cities. The symbol that came to represent American precision in the German civilian consciousness was not a weapon or a machine, but rather an absence. The absence of destruction where destruction had been expected. Margarete Hoffmann's intact apartment building, standing 50 meters from the obliterated ball-bearing plant, became a kind of monument to this absence. Other Germans had their own markers: the church that survived when the surrounding oil depot burned, the school that remained undamaged while the nearby rail yard was cratered, the hospital that bore only broken windows while the adjacent munitions factory lay in ruins. These absences told a story that contradicted everything Germans had been taught about American culture. Nazi ideology portrayed Americans as a mongrel race of gangsters and cowboys, a soft people corrupted by jazz music and Jewish influences. a nation without discipline or purpose. Yet the bombing patterns revealed a military force capable of extraordinary discipline, crews who flew through hell itself to hit specific aim points, who maintained formation discipline under fighter attack, who followed target priorities even when surrounded by flak and dying comrades. This was not the behavior of a soft, undisciplined people. This was professional military competence of a high order. The contrast between expectation and reality created a profound psychological crisis for those Germans who were beginning to doubt Nazi propaganda. If the Americans were not the barbaric murderers that Goebbels described, what else might be false? If American bombers showed restraint even while raining destruction on German industry, what did that suggest about American character and values? These questions, dangerous to voice but impossible to suppress, began to circulate in whispered conversations throughout Germany in 1944 and 1945. Some Germans, particularly those in the military and Nazi Party elite, rejected the evidence of their own eyes and maintained faith in the propaganda narrative. They attributed the survival of residential areas to luck, incompetence, or subterfuge, rather than acknowledge deliberate target selection. Others developed elaborate conspiracy theories. Perhaps the Americans deliberately left some civilians alive to spread defeatist propaganda, or perhaps they targeted only certain factories to preserve infrastructure they planned to seize after winning the war. These explanations, however tortured, served to protect worldviews that could not accommodate the simpler truth that American bombing doctrine reflected a different set of values than those the Nazis practiced. The transformation in German civilian consciousness proceeded slowly and unevenly. Many Germans maintained their hatred of all Allied forces throughout the war and beyond. The death of loved ones in any bombing raid, whether precision or area, created grief that drowned out philosophical distinctions about targeting doctrine. A mother whose son died when a stray American bomb hit a worker dormitory near a targeted factory felt no gratitude for American restraint. Yet even in such cases, survivors often made distinctions. They blamed the Americans for the death of their loved one, but they blamed the British for what seemed like deliberate campaigns of civilian annihilation. The ball bearing, that small steel sphere that became the focus of American strategic planning, acquired symbolic weight in German consciousness. Before the war, few civilians had given much thought to ball bearings. They were industrial components, invisible parts of machines, taken for granted until they failed. But after Schweinfurt and Regensburg were bombed repeatedly for their ball-bearing plants, after German newspapers finally acknowledged, though in coded language, that bearing production was a strategic priority, the humble ball bearing came to represent the entire conflict between American precision and German resilience. In this symbolism, the ball bearing embodied both destruction and survival. American bombs destroyed the factories where bearings were made. Yet German industry continued to function through stockpiles and dispersal. The ball bearing represented American technological sophistication, their ability to identify and target critical industrial nodes, but also American limitations, their inability to completely halt German production despite heavy bombing. For German civilians, the ball bearing became a reminder that while their homes might survive individual raids, their nation's capacity to wage war was being systematically dismantled from above. As 1944 turned to 1945, as the Reich contracted under pressure from both East and West, as defeat became increasingly inevitable, the pattern of American bombing remained consistent, even in the final months of the war, when German resistance had become largely symbolic, and when retribution might have seemed justified. American bomber formations continued to focus on industrial and transportation targets. The 8th and 15th Air Forces hit oil facilities, rail yards, tank factories, and airfields right up until the last days of April 1945. They did not, despite having the capacity to do so, deliberately firebomb German cities in the manner of Dresden or Hamburg. This consistency carried a message that some Germans, particularly those already disillusioned with Nazism, were prepared to hear that American enmity was directed not at the German people but at the Nazi war machine, that when the war ended, Americans would be prepared to distinguish between Germans who had supported Hitler and Germans who had simply endured, that the absence of destruction in their residential streets might foreshadow an absence of vindictive punishment in the post-war world. Such hopes were not universal. Many Germans expected harsh vengeance, regardless of wartime targeting patterns. The propaganda ministry had spent years describing in lurid detail what would happen if the Allies won: mass executions, enslavement, the dismemberment of Germany as a nation. Goebbels' final broadcasts in April 1945 painted apocalyptic pictures of Allied occupation, promising that Germans would be better off dead than under Anglo-American rule. Some Germans, believing these warnings, chose suicide over surrender. Others, particularly women in Eastern Germany, fled westward hoping to reach American or British lines rather than Soviet forces, believing that the Western Allies would be more humane occupiers. These beliefs were based partly on personal experiences with American bombing patterns. Refugees streaming west often told stories that reinforced the perception of American restraint. The Americans bombed the factory but not our homes. The Americans shoot at soldiers but let civilians pass. The Americans drop leaflets warning us to evacuate before attacking military targets. Whether accurate or exaggerated, such stories shaped expectations about occupation. Germans who had experienced American precision bombing hoped for American precision justice, punishment for war criminals and Nazi leaders, but mercy for ordinary civilians who had merely tried to survive. When American forces finally did occupy Western Germany, they brought with them a military government policy that, while hardly gentle, confirmed that American war aims had been targeted at the Nazi regime rather than the German people. The occupation authorities executed war criminals, denazified institutions, and seized German assets, but they did not engage in mass reprisals against civilian populations. They brought food when Germans were starving. They eventually implemented the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt German industry more completely than anyone had imagined possible. The same nation that had destroyed German factories with surgical precision rebuilt them with equal precision, creating an economic foundation that would make West Germany one of Europe's strongest economies within a decade. Margarete Hoffmann survived the war and the occupation. She lived to see Schweinfurt's factories rebuilt, this time producing ball bearings not for tanks and bombers but for automobiles and industrial machinery. In the 1960s, she gave an interview to a German historian studying civilian experiences of strategic bombing. She recalled that January day in 1944, when she emerged from the shelter expecting to find her world destroyed, and instead found only the factory damaged. "I remember thinking that whoever was flying those planes must have children like my daughter," she said. "Because they could have killed us so easily, but they didn't. They destroyed what needed to be destroyed and left us alive. At the time, I was still too afraid and too loyal to think clearly about what that meant. But later, after everything, I understood. They were not fighting us. They were fighting the war machine that had taken our husbands and sons. They were fighting the regime that had destroyed our nation. We were simply in the way, and they tried their best not to kill us while still doing their job." This understanding that American bombing had attempted to distinguish between Nazi Germany, the war machine, and Germans, the people, became part of the foundation for post-war German-American relations. It was not the only foundation. American aid and protection from Soviet expansion mattered more strategically, but the psychological preparation created by precision bombing patterns should not be underestimated. Germans who had experienced American restraint in war were more willing to trust American intentions in peace. The statistical record supports German civilian perceptions. Studies conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey after the war analyzed bomb damage patterns across dozens of German cities. The surveys found that in cities bombed primarily by American forces during daylight raids, industrial and transportation facilities suffered an average damage rate of 73%, while residential areas showed 22% damage. In cities bombed primarily by RAF forces during night raids, industrial facilities showed 61% damage, while residential areas suffered 58% damage. These figures confirm what German civilians reported. American raids concentrated damage on industrial targets, while British raids distributed damage more evenly across entire urban areas. The casualty statistics tell a similar story. German civilian deaths from Allied bombing totaled approximately 400,000 to 600,000, depending on which historical estimates one accepts. The majority of these deaths, perhaps 3/4, occurred in RAF night raids rather than American daylight attacks. This disparity existed despite the fact that American forces dropped roughly equal tonnage of bombs on Germany as British forces. The difference lay in target selection and bombing technique. British area raids aimed to create firestorms that would kill workers in their homes. American precision raids aimed to destroy factories, and civilians died only when accuracy failed or when factories were located near residential areas. These patterns became part of German post-war memory in complex ways. Some Germans used the distinction between American and British bombing to absolve themselves of responsibility for Nazi crimes. If the Americans had tried not to kill civilians, perhaps Germans had also been victims rather than perpetrators. This equation was false and self-serving. The Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities were deliberate campaigns of extermination that bore no resemblance to American bombing, which always maintained an industrial rather than genocidal objective. Yet the false equivalence appeared in German discourse for decades, a way of deflecting guilt by pointing to Allied bombing as a comparable crime. More honest German observers acknowledged that American precision bombing, while devastating to German industry, had been consistent with the laws of war and strategic military necessity. Factories producing weapons were legitimate military targets under any interpretation of international law. That American forces had attempted to minimize collateral civilian casualties, even while having no legal obligation to do so, spoke to a military culture that retained some ethical boundaries even in total war. This acknowledgement did not erase German guilt for Nazi crimes, but it did create space for post-war reconciliation. The bomber crews who flew the precision raids rarely knew the impact their target selection had on German civilian consciousness. They were too busy staying alive, nursing damaged aircraft back to England, mourning lost comrades, and preparing for the next mission. Most of them understood only in abstract terms that they were targeting factories rather than cities. The distinction seemed academic when flak was tearing through aluminum and fighters were making head-on attacks. Yet their commitment to doctrine, their willingness to risk death attempting to hit specific aim points rather than simply dropping on urban areas, created the pattern that German civilians recognized. Lieutenant James Morgan, the bombardier who had released bombs over Schweinfurt in January 1944, survived his 25-mission tour and returned to Nebraska. He never knew that Margaretti Hoffman had stood beside his target an hour after he bombed it, staring at the destruction in shock and confusion. He never knew that his bomb run, one of thousands flown by thousands of American airmen, had contributed to a psychological shift in German civilian consciousness. He knew only that he had done his job, that he had hit his assigned target, that he had followed the doctrine he had been taught. That this adherence to doctrine had strategic consequences beyond destroying ball-bearing plants never occurred to him until decades later, when historians began analyzing the psychological impact of precision bombing on occupied populations. The transformation in German civilian consciousness that precision bombing helped create was neither complete nor universal. Many Germans retained their hatred of all Allied forces throughout their lives. Many others simply focused on survival and recovery rather than philosophical questions about bombing doctrine. But enough Germans recognized the pattern and internalized its implications to matter historically. When the Federal Republic of Germany aligned firmly with the United States during the Cold War, when German voters supported American military presence on German soil, when German industry integrated itself into American-led international trade systems, these choices were enabled partly by the foundation of trust that had been unexpectedly built during the war itself. The absence of destruction where destruction had been expected became, in memory, a kind of promise. The intact apartment building beside the ruined factory suggested that American power, though devastating, was not indiscriminate. That it could be precise meant it could also be just. That it had been restrained when restraint was not required meant it might be generous when the war ended. These were fragile hopes, easily destroyed by post-war vindictiveness, but they were allowed to grow because American occupation policy largely validated them. The ball bearing, that small steel sphere that rotated silently inside machines, carried the weight of these transformations, From industrial component to strategic target to post-war symbol, it represented the entire arc of American strategic bombing doctrine and its unintended consequences. German civilians who had seen ball-bearing plants destroyed while their homes survived understood, on some level, that they had witnessed a different kind of warfare than they had been taught to expect. They had experienced the difference between targeting and terror, between precision and massacre, between destroying an enemy's capacity to wage war and destroying an enemy people. This difference mattered. It did not erase the horror of war or the guilt of German participation in Nazi crimes. It did not prevent the deaths of tens of thousands of German civilians from American bombs. It did not make the survivors grateful for the destruction they witnessed, but it created a psychological space where reconciliation could eventually occur, where former enemies could become allies, where devastated nations could rebuild together. In the end, the shock that German civilians experienced when American planes targeted only factories and not homes was the shock of discovering that the enemy was not what propaganda had promised. The Americans were not bloodthirsty savages who delighted in murder. They were professionals executing a military strategy, attempting to destroy Germany's capacity to make war while minimizing unnecessary killing. This discovery did not make them heroes in German eyes. They were still the enemy, still destroying German cities, still killing German people. But it made them comprehensible enemies, rational actors pursuing strategic objectives rather than monsters seeking random slaughter. That comprehension, that recognition of rationality and restraint in the midst of total war, became the foundation for everything that followed. The post-war German-American alliance, the economic miracle of Reconstruction, the successful reintegration of Germany into the Western democratic order, all of these depended on Germans being willing to trust American intentions. That trust was not inevitable. It required careful cultivation through occupation policy, economic aid, and diplomatic engagement, but it was made possible in part by what German civilians had observed during the bombing war, that American power, while terrible, was not arbitrary, that it struck with precision at military targets rather than with random fury at civilians, that even in the midst of total war, some boundaries had been maintained, some distinctions honored. The bombers are gone now. The factories have been rebuilt. The generation that witnessed the raids has mostly passed away, but the pattern they observed remains in the historical record, a testament to the possibility that even in the darkest moments of warfare, even in conflicts of extermination and survival, the choices combatants make about how to employ violence still matter. The difference between targeting factories and targeting homes seems small when bombs are falling, but from that small difference, enormous consequences flow. Recognition of enemy humanity, preservation of post-war civilian infrastructure, psychological preparation for reconciliation, all emerged from the decision to aim bombardiers' crosshairs at factory roofs instead of apartment blocks. Margarete Hoffmann's daughter, spared by accidents of accuracy and doctrine, grew up to witness the German economic miracle, to see her nation transformed from devastated dictatorship to prosperous democracy, to watch German and American leaders stand together as allies against new threats. She never knew the name of the bombardier who had dropped bombs near her home that January day. She never knew which decision in which briefing room had determined that Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants would be targeted while residential areas would be avoided when possible. She knew only what she had been told by her mother, that the Americans could have killed them but chose to bomb only the factory. That choice, multiplied across thousands of raids and millions of German civilians, became one of the quiet foundations of the post-war order. The symbol remains not in monuments or museums but in memory, the memory of absence, of expected destruction that never came, of homes left standing beside shattered factories, of lives spared not by mercy, but by doctrine. In that absence dwells a truth about power and restraint, about the difference between fighting a regime and destroying a people, about the possibility that even in total war, some boundaries can be honored and some distinctions maintained. The shock German civilians felt when they discovered American bombs hitting only factories and not homes was the shock of discovering that the world was not as propaganda had painted it, that enemies could show restraint, that military power could be precise rather than arbitrary. From that shock grew recognition. From recognition grew the possibility of trust. From trust grew alliance. And from alliance emerged a peace more durable than any that could have been built on ashes and atrocity alone. The bombs that fell on Schweinfurt that January morning destroyed ball bearings and machinery, buildings and infrastructure. But by sparing the homes beside the factories, by demonstrating through repeated raids that American targeting was deliberate rather than random, they also destroyed something else. The propaganda narrative that had painted all enemies as identical, all military force as equally barbaric, all warfare as indistinguishable terror. In the precision of destruction lay the seeds of reconstruction. In the pattern of targeting lay the foundation for reconciliation. And in the shock of civilians who expected massacre but experienced only the devastation of factories lay the beginning of understanding that not all enemies were the same, that some military forces maintained distinctions even in total war, and that the absence of atrocity where atrocity was expected might, in time, become the basis for a different kind of peace. The ball bearing spins silently in its housing, steel against steel, friction reduced to near nothing, enabling motion and industry and reconstruction. Once a target, now a component of ordinary life, it carries in its mundane function the memory of a time when its production brought terror from the sky, terror aimed with precision at factories rather than homes, destroying Germany's capacity to make war while attempting, imperfectly but deliberately, to spare German lives. That attempt mattered. Those spared civilians remembered. And in their memory, the post-war world found one of its many foundations, built not on ruins alone, but on the ruins that stood beside structures left intact. A pattern of destruction that revealed, even in the midst of total war, the possibility of restraint and the choice to honor, however imperfectly, the distinction between soldiers and civilians, between military targets and human homes, between defeating an enemy and destroying a people.